So, you may want to design a tiny home, and preferably with the minimum help from an architect, engineer, or a contractor. Now, we'll talk at the end of this particular video about why you may still want a contractor, even, and maybe you'll change your mind about that. But one thing that you should know is definitely, at the very least, some basic drawing and measurements, right? You should understand basic math and really preferably geometry, I think, will get you surprisingly far in terms of design, period, and the design world, period, in terms of architecture and engineering. But I'm going to help you understand how to really design this tiny home and make it make sense. Because this idea of tiny homes is actually, it's misleading in so many ways because it seems so basic. But the space restrictions actually makes this project more design heavy. So as really like many projects, I think I would always really recommend you spend that time up front and really invest in the upfront cost of the time spent in this design phase, right? So this doesn't have to necessarily be drawing, this can just be planning, but it's designing the project in general. And this is where you can save a lot of money and a lot of headache. Now, we're going to go ahead and talk about a few things regarding design, and that's going to get you really started in the juices flowing for really trying to take on this project. Now, one, I can make blueprints and charge you for a consultation, but I'd really prefer in either case for you to take the time to learn about the project. I'm not, in terms of the consultation, that's probably the better option, because if I do end up going to anything regarding providing you with blueprints, I'm not going to charge you less than market, and that's kind of, it's troubling to think that really a lot of people have come to a determination that their money means they get whomever they want, and it's a bit troubling in terms of that particular concept and how widespread that is, especially in America. But in any case, number one, we're going to really talk about space here. And assuming that your tiny home won't be mobile, you need to understand that space is going to be important, right? So this concept of space in terms of how you are regulated by, and really avoid any conflicts in terms of, with your neighbors or just the county or governmental regulations in general. You want to understand something called the buildable area. Now, this is going to be different depending on your particular area, and in terms of the regulations usually comes down to zoning, but also things like the neighborhood association, or whatever. Make sure you really iron out the details with them in terms of understanding the buildable area and the restrictions imposed upon this project. And that's honestly one of the first things, right? In terms of actually understanding what we want to do here, how we can move forward here. Uh, Another thing in terms of space is you want to think about this in terms of entry, exit, and privacy, right? Because entry and exit, if there are going to be guests in this particular tiny home, where are they going to park? Are they going to park on the street? Are they going to actually pull up to the space? And where's your driveway going to have to be located if you do have to install a driveway to this space? These are huge questions, and what's that driveway also going to be made of, right? These are things that you need to kind of work out. And also the idea of privacy is going to be associated with really who you expect to be in the home, right? Because if these are family members, you may not think about this as much. But if these are, if you're building a tiny home to really try and create a source of income for yourself and rent out the tiny home, then you may want to really think about the actual fencing, fencing or in shielding yourself and from them and them from you, and making that tiny home really more appealing to certain type of people. And in terms of this whole idea, you can get this to a certain degree in terms of understanding what's happening with a certain degree. So a lot of counties, they have like GIS, and you can look that up. That's going to be something that can get you so far. But in terms of understanding the site itself, the actual site itself, you can get an understanding of the buildable area through the GI. I forget what it's called, geographic, but basically the county or the regulating agency, they'll usually create this site to where you can go and understand what's on your particular land and the borders of your land, and also maybe even get understanding about the zoning and the setbacks as well. But when it comes down to the idea of what you can actually do, right, like the actual plan, you can get so far by yourself. But understanding that you will likely need a site survey, right? You need to get a legitimate survey, because one, liability wise, if you mess up, then these guys can really help in terms of actually holding someone liable, right? But also just the idea of time and the money spent in a project. You don't want to start a project and realize that you're in a place that is a legitimate problem. And that right there brings me to the idea of the footprint, because you should understand the perimeter dimensions of your tiny home. And this is something that is going to really have to fit in this buildable area, right? And this is where the design may get very interesting, right? So you may have this concept of, oh, I'd love this here and here, and you don't really have an understanding of the buildable area, the restrictions based on what's underneath the ground, or what the survey actually purveys to you. But in terms of the actual footprint, when you have that buildable area and you get to the point to where you're developing a footprint, this is ultimately where a lot of this starts in terms of your actual design building itself. And if it comes down to you having a complicated area or complicated land and space, the restrictions, and you really want to understand squares and rectangles, they're going to be the simplest to build. They're going to be the simplest in terms of actually constructing things. When you move outside of that basic square, basic rectangle, you start to pile on complications, and you have to think about a lot more than what you may expect. So this idea of complicated land. Now this can be the shape of the buildable area, but it can also be the slope of the buildable area. You may have to think about a lot of components of this particular tiny home fitting into whatever land that you have. And I'd like to see buildings that are built for the land. That's something that I really like to see. It frustrates me. Like big builders frustrate me to no end. But the idea of what you're doing here, you really want to try to make it specialized to the land in any case. And that's like going to the buildable area and more complex buildable areas. You may want to go ahead and just bite the bullet and really hire a consultant, hire like a creative guy out there and really help. And we'll get into a bit about kind of the what to expect and really getting designers out there on the field at the end. But understand that this is something that when you do have that complicated land and that complicated space, those are things that could definitely save you time and money in terms of a lot of change orders and a lot of headaches that pile up on construction sites, especially if you're doing this yourself and you don't have a contractor to really act as the filter. This is where you get a lot of bang for buck for designers, right? You understand this is the field, and this is something that can also help you filter out designers that may not really be up to more complex tiny home projects or ADU projects. This is something that can help you in terms of selecting. And you don't really have to, if you ask the right questions and you have the right information, you can really save yourself a lot of money even meeting, or time and money even meeting with a lot of guys out there. And the foundation, and this is interesting because when it comes down to foundations and what's happening on how to essentially get this basically a support for your particular building. What's interesting about this, basically what the foundation does is it transfers the load or the weight into the soil, right? So there's ways to do this, tons of different ways to do this, and these aren't going to be well known and well established through really one guy. And we'll talk more about this whole this idea of what to expect when you hire design professionals. But design and foundations, when it comes down to this idea and this concept, you've got a number of things, right? You got frames that can be steel and wood, and they can kind of go in with different kind of post construction that kind of lead to really, it's usually going to be concrete, concrete rebar in the actual footing, or in an actual footing, or a small 2x2 area, and that can be one foundation. And you can also have, of course, the conventional slab, right? So that's all concrete, right? So you don't necessarily have the frame above the frame built around to essentially make this whole thing work in a series of posts. You have one large slab where your actual building goes on top of that. Now, this is one thing. And this could include also where things get really interesting is the idea of land. And well, there's two ways that there's two different ways we're going to talk about in terms of the foundation. But the idea of retaining walls and basement walls. When you have particularly a set of land and you want to do a project, and that kind of goes with the land, and you don't have just a flat piece of land that's just ideal, I suppose, for really just simple projects, you'd be surprised about how creative you can get with different ideas, right? Like I said, I'm gonna always go to bat for the guy that takes that time to say, hey, let's try to figure out how we can make this building work for the land that's available. It's going to help a lot. And that right there, in terms of the retaining walls and the basement walls, could be a huge part of that, right? In terms of actually turning this into a more creative project. But also things like, in terms of the idea of what this project can be and what it can become, the mixture, right? So just because you got these various different foundation options doesn't mean that they can't combine and mix in certain ways. So understand that you don't necessarily have to do one or the other depending on your particular project. It can really, really help to mix and kind of combine things. You got to think about things when you mix, particularly like, for instance, let's say I got a slab on one side and then I got a kind of a frame post configuration on the other side. You got to think about how that's experienced by the people living in that building, right? So if I move from the flooring, right? So the flooring for the slab transferring to the flooring for the frame. Those are things that can be felt and experienced depending on what you do or don't do and what you plan for or don't plan for. And I'll be honest, this idea of a footprint, I have a pretty strong background in, I suppose, engineering, but when it comes down to this idea, this isn't something that really is going to make a tremendous this isn't going to be a tremendous focus for people building the normal conventional tiny homes. And so be aware of it, but also be aware that there are projects out there that are simply just put together already, and they're simple. They don't necessarily have to go over all of the complexities of the options and things of that nature. And now, and I suppose I'm going to add this. I don't have this as a particular note for this particular video, but I think it's important. This idea of pre-built construction, excellent, but it may not be for everybody, right? Just to give you guys an idea, I once went to a seminar where this guy was basically advertising a concept of a pre-built home. I don't even think it was a tiny home. I think it was just a home in general. But the problem with this was this home was designed to really pass the most stringent qualifications. And that right there is really excellent. I think he came from California. But the problem was, in terms of, we were at the time I was in Georgia, and nobody really needed steel, particularly in this project. It was like steel frames, right? That wasn't something that's going to be cost convenient or for the customer in any way, shape, or form, I felt like. So this idea of pre-built construction, I think it does work for certain people, but be aware when it doesn't work for you. Understand that and have that kind of mapped out. I think it, like I said, it definitely has a place, but when you have an understanding, like when you carry a pretty solid understanding of just, or not even carry a solid understanding, when you go around and you look for prices, um, you know, at recommending at least 3 price outs for every construction project, for every trade that comes on your field. But when you handle that particular portion, you may find that, hey, I'm getting the same guy or the same project or the same actual project built in a different way, but it won't be there won't be a gain in terms of how this project is experienced. And take that into consideration. Pre-built projects are excellent. I think they have a tremendous place in terms of this idea of just construction in general, and if done right, it can even be done in ways that promote more affordable construction. Period, and that could be really powerful. But I'll be honest with you, like a lot of this isn't really designed based on the actual location, and you want to make sure that it is that. In terms of actually framing, let's say that we're not working with pre-built construction. We're focusing just on walls right now. When we talk about framing, conventional framing in terms of wood construction or lumber, you'll really run into 2 types of walls in terms of thickness that are really just the most used, right? And that's 2x4s and 2x6s. Very, uh, very interesting points in terms of actually, like, even putting this on paper, I think is worth noting. 2x4 is 3.5 inches. 2x6 is 5.5 inches. When it comes down to architects and architecture, one thing that really frustrates me in general, I think, is when I'd be sitting at a computer, helping to modify a plan or something, and the plan would not dimension to the 2x4, it would dimension to the exterior cladding of the 2x4, whatever, right? So if you have and if you're working with a program that does that, usually it gets really confusing because you have the plywood, you have and then you have whatever, there can be a space in between if you're, and there can also be the actual siding itself in terms of the thickness of the siding that the program accounts for. And when it comes down to those blueprints, those measurements are not only are they just completely useless, they are actually a detriment to people that need to measure, because these guys, there's only one trade that looks at the blueprints to get the actual measurement. These people that look at the blueprints to get the measurement, they are looking for framing. They are looking for concrete. The support, those supporting trades. Exterior cladding, I want to measure my room, all that stuff. You take out a tape measure, you get what you need, whatever from what's there. The framing, they say, hey, what's the plan? What do we want to do here? And that is the only dimension that should be on those particular, when we're talking about plan view dimensions. There are so many things that will, I like that frustrate me about like kind of planning in general, and I'll make another video about just a few of them. But that idea of just putting things on paper, you should understand when you put this on paper, those concepts of that concept of how much space is valuable. That's only going to apply to the concrete guy or the site guy and the framer. That's it. Nobody else. That's the everybody else. They pull out a tape measure and they look at what's there and they go off of that. Um, and that right there, I think it's a tangent, but I think it's worth it. But when it comes down to framing, conventional framing, the 2x6 and the 2x4s. Now, in terms of a quote unquote tiny home, right? We're not talking about just just crazy heavy loads, right? We're talking about just usually it's going to be just the roof. Sometimes there can be like one floor above if you guys are doing something, and sometimes it can be like kind of a loft situation as well. But usually it's going to be a 2x4. 2x4 are usually going to be light loads. Um, the heavy loads aren't really going to usually be a case in terms of with these type of projects, right? Unless it's, I mean, I would say a tiny home is defined by the idea that it's not going to be a heavy load involved in terms of the actual like weight that the occupant is, or the occupants are going to really burden the foundation and the framing with. But they're, in terms of the framing itself, these are things that are decided based on the height, the ceiling height, right? And this right here is an IRC chart, right? I'll be honest with you guys, I'm more restrictive in a lot of cases than the IRC because I've played with some of these numbers and they don't quite make sense to me, and they don't seem to be something that they're definitely not something that I would recommend or design in general. But it's nice to be able to point to, I suppose, county and say, hey, you guys said this. Why is this? And that goes over. Where like I can in terms of the IRC, I put this chart in front of you just to show you kind of how things are regulated. But there is a gap. There is a significant gap between how things are regulated by the quote-unquote government and how they should be regulated in terms of the actual engineering involved with a lot of these particular components. And, I mean, sometimes things are completely overbuilt in a lot of cases, and sometimes they're just underbuilt. And I would much rather see something overbuilt in most cases. And in terms of the 2x4, the walls, that or the 2x material, 2x4 versus 2x6 conventional framing, these things are going to differ based on the ceiling height, right? So if you have, I think I post this here, but I think the IRC says something like, oh, if it's like over like I think 11 feet or something, then you can use a 2x6 or something like that. And I'd say if it is over 9 feet, right? So if you are 10 feet more, then it's 2x6. There is no, like, I would never put that on paper, right? But the IRC does. If you guys want to play with fire, by all means, the IRC seems like a great place to be able to point if the flames rise. Now, this idea of framing the 2x6 versus the 2x4, that ceiling height is one factor, right? And this is by no means a cover-all, right? So if you have floors above you, that's going to drop the ceiling height normally, right? So 9 feet is pretty steady with like one floor and one roof in terms of this idea, right? So look at the IRC for your particular project, because I don't know the spans you're working with. I don't know the beam, or if there's beams in your particular project or whatever. But when it comes down to the actual IRC measurement, right? So you're looking at what's there based on kind of the span chart for the roof, right? So if your roof's taking on a significant amount of roof load, a significant amount of floor load, then those things are going to have a factor, right? So if you look at the IRC chart, you're going to kind of have to take a moment to understand it, right? So, and I'll go over that maybe in another video, but the idea here is that 2x4s, if I had to make a broad statement about this particular idea and I had a gun to my head, because I, I have, like, because I definitely like nuance way too much, but the idea of like a 2x4 versus a 2x6, not above 9 feet, you're looking at a 2x6. Below 9 feet, or 9 feet or below, is 2x4, and that's where I would usually stand with those things. Now, when it comes down to the wall thickness, another thing that you want to consider is the idea of insulating this space, because that can change things drastically, right? So we're talking about stability, right? But when we're talking about insulation, you may want to think about that as well. And it may help if you move, surprisingly, if you move from a 2x4 to a 2x6, you may actually get away with increasing the spacing, right? So only use the increments in the actual, in the actual IRC. I think it's like 19.2 or 19.2 inches. So usually standard studs are 16 inches on center. And if you increase spacing, then they could be 19.2 inches on center, and also 24 inches on center. And they do that for the plywood. The actual sheathing that goes on top of those. That's why those spacings are important. Don't just get out there and think that you can do whatever you want to do, right? Then when the plywood comes, you got a huge problem with the plywood, or not a huge problem, but you're gonna have to buy some material just to basically make sure you got plywood to nail, or you got some studs to nail plywood to. Now, but this idea of, if your particular project is going to require more insulation and as much insulation as that a 2x6 would allow, you may be able to increase that spacing from the standard 2x4, which is likely going to be something like 16 inches on center, to something that's going to be more like 24 inches on center or 19.2 inches on center. And you could end up saving yourself a lot of money that way, actually, which would be really nice if it worked out like that. So maybe even look into that, even if you aren't necessarily in a position where you have to use 2x6s. Now, and I'm talking about kind of exterior and non-load bearing walls, right? But if you have interior non-load bearing walls, those are going to be different, right? So designating between load bearing and non-load bearing is usually a big deal. With tiny homes, probably a lot less so, because there's I would guess if it's a basic tiny home, then the only load bearing walls are going to be the exterior walls, which are designed to bear loads. But when it comes down to non-load bearing walls, they're usually only there for separation purposes, right? That's it. Like, they are there to separate spaces, and you can use 2x4s, and I would say you can use, like, the problem with, you can use 2x4s up to like 12 feet or something. And the idea is nothing's depending on them, right? But another problem with using 2x4s for kind of those long spans, if you have like 11, 12-foot ceilings, another problem that you may run into is the idea of finding straight 2x4s. You might not be able to find those. You might be better off using 2x6s even on the interior. And if for some reason you can get away with using 2x4s in the interior and you find some straight ones, by all means. If it's non-load bearing, I personally don't really care. Now, framing floors. This isn't going to be for everyone designing a tiny home, obviously. But if your tiny home has a loft or a second floor, you're going to need a floor system, right? So this is something that is you're getting into some more intense, right? So you're going into a lot more than just dabbing your toes into design work. I would say when you look at things like floor loads, this idea of a floor system, and and I say floor loads because that's what determines a floor system. That's what's ultimately going to determine that, right? Uh, and if you look at a floor system, it's interesting, right? So the IRC, right? So this idea of regulating floor, the IRC really regulate. I mean, they have things for days. You can poke around and look at the index for that and see what they have. But in terms of the floors, it's they have two separate charts, and the two separate charts are based on two different loading criteria. Live loads, and live, and these loading criteria are separate. These loading criteria are made up of live loads and dead loads. Dead loads are just what's existing, right? Usually it comes down to what the construction itself weighs, um, and live loads are what the occupants are going to move in and out of this particular space. And that is it's and I'm using this particular definition. This is kind of a broad stroke definition, right? If you look at the IRC, you'll see two different criterias, at least two. Maybe there could be more, but I know there's two different live loads that they use particularly. And the live loads for 30 PSF and 40 PSF. And basically what this is 40 pounds per square foot or 30 pounds per square foot. Now, if you walk around in, whatever space, the idea of 30 pounds per square foot is a 30-pound block that is 1 foot by 1 foot covering your entire floor space, right? A 40 pounds per square foot is the 40-pound block. Those things, that difference, as working with engineers, we had to play with those numbers a little bit to try to get certain things in certain situations to essentially work, because that gives you a lot of leeway, honestly. If you think about 30 pounds per square foot and 40 pounds per square foot, that's a lot sometimes. And 30 pounds per square foot is also that's something that's it's reasonable to expect that in more locations, in more locations than what we really are regulated to expect that. Uh, when it comes down to these blocks, right? What's happening with those? Usually 30 pounds per square foot we put as those are sleeping rooms, right? So this is where usually the idea is one person's using this room as their personal space to sleep. They come in the room and there's not going to be a significant amount of foot traffic, right? When it comes down to hallways, living rooms, kitchens, that's where we stop using this concept of 30 pounds per square foot, and that's where they want to make sure and beef up the floors. What is interesting about this is, like I said, this is broad stroke, because if there is, say for instance, you want to have a water bed or a grand piano, those things weigh more, obviously. Now, and they're not going to be moved as much. So, as a designer, I might go ahead and plug this in as a dead load when I have to design this particular floor system. And that is going to change things drastically. and especially, of course, things like hot tubs or whatever. But the idea is this space is now designed to hold, or this particular area or space, sometime depending on what's the particular situation. There's sometimes where I'll say, hey, look, if you guys want to move the hot tub, you can move it here, you can move it here. Don't move it over to, whatever location. And that'll be kind of a something that I work out with a particular client or something. But the idea is that this is how things are going to essentially be designed, right? And the IRC has these charts. These charts, if you have a sleeping load, then you can use this, the 30 PSF chart. If you have a, something to where you're expecting more, more space, more usage of the space by more people, then you're going to use the 40 PSF. And I can go over just different ideas about this in general, but just for tiny homes in general, I want to keep this to understanding that those things are great, like easy to kind of, put those things on, on a blueprint and design for those things in general. And you can look at a particular space and help, just the framers or the people that come after you by kind of working this out and helping people understand, especially if you do have special loads. If you are doing something and you're planning something extravagant, if you're rolling in the money to really do something more extravagant, absolutely just, hire one of those, one of the architects that really seem to focus on like high-end projects. I think they're really good. They're really competent. They have excellent people. And if you're kind of thinking about something extravagant and and I guess if you're a little bit more worried about the budget, then you can totally get a consultation, and or from yours truly. I would totally love to help you guys. And this idea of a particular floor system, particularly we're talking about floor systems now, when they are kind of not conventional, right? They can easily become an issue, right? They can easily become something to where the framer is now stepping in and using the hat of the architect, especially when you haven't really spent the time understanding the complications of the project. Now, when it comes down to framing roofs, if you are designing a basic tiny home, this like everything, this shouldn't be much of an issue. And hopefully, I'm over explaining everything if you're for your particular situation. But if it's outside of that, or not hopefully, but you should be aware that I could be definitely over explaining a lot of things in terms of actually tiny home construction. And if you're thinking about this, and if you're thinking about this too much when you just have a simple square or rectangle, absolutely don't. Just kind of look at what you got, and if you're kind of worried about whether this is something that standard framers and lumber companies can really work with and design for, and really just give you enough efficiency to work with them, then by all means you can hire me for a consultation, and I'll be happy to help. But this idea of framing roofs, if you live in in terms of roofs in general, if you live in a place that requires a special type of snow load, right? And the idea is that roof can it may see a lot of snow, right? That's the it. Those things, that concept in general, will require more design. That will require more on the design end in terms of actually trying to get the right roof and these particular places. But if you're, I mean, like if this is a basic shape, if you're not going too far, then this might be something that is easily dealt with. Not, and this could, I mean, it couldn't make it, if you have, for instance, if you have roof trusses, then the snow load for a roof truss that's like 16 feet long may not even change the like configuration required for the roof truss. You know, it may require some like some rather than like it may require some special grade lumber or something in that roof truss, but it won't like be a significant figure for your bottom line, right? In terms of the actual roof, or in terms of actually getting the roof constructed itself. Um, Now, when we're talking about moving outside of the standard square and rectangles, this is, you know, this is the roof. We talked about how complexities can kind of add up in construction. I think the roof is where things add up the most when you start to leave that or leave that general footprint, right? And let's say it's like oh, I just want to kind of move out the house a little bit here to create kind of a cute niche or something like that. It's nice. That can change. That can really change things for the inside. That can completely alter just the experience geometry of the inside of the house, and also, right. And that's in addition to costing more, right? And what you have to do. And this can easily pile up for like things like change orders and stuff like that. So once you have a plan, it's probably best to stay in that plan. Like if you move outside that plan with no understanding of what's required in terms of the structural, like if you're changing like the shape of a house, that's structural. That's not something that you can just, oh, I'm just going to move this out a little bit. If you do that, then it is going to cost you. It is like it's absolutely going to cost you, and it could cost you both time, money, and the actual inside geometry experience. That's not something that you can just brush up with and change, or that you can expect to just brush up and change. Now, in terms of the idea of a roof in general, I think is interesting because this is really the part where uh, most people will have trouble in terms of visualizing and understanding what happens, right? You can't, it's not easy to just go in and visualize the changes that are expected of a roof. You can't really, like, this is, you gotta, maybe some pretty, like, solid, really solid architects in terms of those really used to working in those 3D, working in 3D, maybe they'll have more of an understanding of that. But in terms of those conventional designers, those CAD guys out there, don't you dare expect them to like write a new roof plan for your particular project and help you kind of quote out a roof. Don't even try it. Like it's absolutely off the table. Um, and if they do, then they probably have some. I mean, you got lucky. You got really lucky. But I mean, don't expect that. That's absolutely off the table. Now, in terms of, I say, architecture, right? And this whole idea of the shape is architecture, right? So I know architecture because I had to design to support certain architecture, right? And that's where I really understand and have developed my understanding, and really I think a very solid, more solid understanding than you can get from simply just designing architecture without that structural understanding. But in terms of that architecture and what they do, you should understand that, particularly with tiny homes, right? We talked about how it's deceptive in terms of tiny homes and their design. And we talked about just a few things with the actual structure itself. And like I said, I could have been over explaining a lot of those things. But with architecture, this is something that you want to pay very close attention to, right? In terms of the way the architecture is regulated, that upfront cost in terms of the design work. When you are working with a tiny home, you have to understand restrictions. You have to have a very intimate knowledge of the restrictions, the hallway widths, the stair heights, the stair widths, the bathrooms. They have required dimensions. And for instance, like hallways, usually, like when it comes down to kind of designing in restrictive spaces, you're going to run into you're going to need to understand the width requirements. You're also like you're going to need to understand with things like the stairs. If there are stairs in your tiny home, you're going to really you want to understand the height requirements. And that's for a few reasons, right? Because if you can help it, you don't want people to bump their heads, even if it's not conventionally regulated by an inspector. You want that to be understood. Like, hey, why, what do I have to do here? What can I do here to make this more convenient? Now, things like bathrooms also have to fit toilets. They have to fit toilets comfortably and be well thought out regarding the shower or the tub arrangements. These are going to be with dimensional understandings that you have to have in terms of these particular things. And you can look at the IRC. I'll try to like add some screenshots for the conventional toilet requirements and shower requirements, but also this is we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the idea also of these restrictions the restrictions and dimensional requirements, they apply to ceilings as well. And ceilings have to be at least 7 feet according to the IRC. And that is, like I said, like you want to understand these things, right? Regardless of whether you're conventionally regulated or not, because you want to understand why they're like that, right? If your tiny home is going to be built to like accommodate like ADU or have like handicap in any way, you want to make sure that things are designed for that, right? And these are things that the architect has to grapple with. They have to understand, like, okay, these are this is going to be used here, there, and it seems like they're coming in, and you don't really like see much going through their head in terms of what they're particularly grappling with any situation, but that takes up a tremendous amount, right? And when it comes down to the ADUs in general, and for anybody wondering about handicap requirements in terms of the actual architecture required, you can expect things like wider hallway widths. Think about fitting, the actual wheelchairs, right? You have to think about more space in the bathroom. That idea of how to make this place be able to fit a wheelchair, but also things like grab bars as well in the bathroom. These are also like when we're talking about the entry, like even entering the home, when you're planning for the driveway, when you're planning for the threshold at the door, those doors are now going to have to be made sure to be ADU. So like a conventional doorway may not really be convenient for wheelchair access. You'll have to think about things like that. Now, when it comes down to just really, really like the architects understanding the space, they also have intimate knowledge with the materials, right? The materials that fit in this space. When you're designing this, if you're putting to paper any type of tiny home or whatever, you need to understand the windows, the window spaces, the door frames, the door spaces, the rough, and they call it the rough opening, right? So when you're designing for certain particular, doors or whatever, you should understand the rough opening requirements, and that'll give you what that is that's the framing, the actual dimension of the framing. Because remember when I said that's the only dimension that really counts, right? The framer and the concrete guy, but the framer in this case, right? When it comes down to things like windows, don't just think like, wow, that would be cute if we did that there. Understand where you're going to get that window, how you're going to get that window, because if it's a custom made window, then it's going to cost custom made prices. It's not going to be something that's manufactured in bulk. They're going to charge you because it's custom. When it comes down to things like countertops, counter spaces, cabinets, stuff like that, those are things that you're going to have to think about already, but even more so, of course, with things like ADU, because those spaces have to be built to accommodate like the idea of someone in a wheelchair, someone who is handicapped. When it comes down to utilities, we're talking just kind of broad strokes. We're talking about power and plumbing, right? And I say power because electricity can be adapted to provide heat, right? So the idea is you can also include gas in there as well if if you're a gas guy. But when it comes down to the idea of plenty of having plenty of power for your particular situation, you should look into things around particularly like grants around sustainable initiative or just large scale projects in the city, because you may be surprised to find just opportunities to pay in turn, or opportunities to help finance and really help incentivize just certain things if you include certain things in this project. And that's more so going to be on the power side of things. When it comes down to just heating options in general, you want to be, if you can design the space in a certain way to where only a section needs to be heated, that's going to be better. And you can save money based off of just basically just having only a portion of the house having to be heated. And this can come in different forms, right? You can have just a space heater that heats the bedroom and the bathroom or something like that, and you only have to like walk out the front door, so you don't have to worry about the rest of the house. But think about that, right? So the usage of the space, right? If you know how the space is going to be used, you'd be surprised about what you can design for. Also, when it comes down to themes around, I would suppose, like just electricity and heating in general, like I think about these ideas, but my primary understanding is going to really be in just structural, right? So I don't want you guys to I'll give you guys the insight of really, I guess, the contractor type of insight, not necessarily the engineering insight, because I know that I've started to kind of look at different options for powering homes and stuff like that. And there's things out there, but always look at the cost and risk analysis, right? Have that. Don't just, say, oh, solar is going to be sustainable, and you have no clue about the solar that's actually, or the solar panels that's available. You may have to essentially just I would say do some research more than just hiring a consultant, because usually consultants are paid by people who are selling solar and selling a certain solar panel. But you can simply go online, look, and do a little bit of research and find out what you can get. And same thing with heating, of course, like finding out how you can heat a space, what's available, what are the, you know, does it make sense for that small heater to be on, or is it going to be better to, heat the whole house at a consistent, have that at a consistent heat? Because a lot of the energy is going to be really paired with powering on the device. That's where a lot of expenditure goes into, right? So understanding, and having sources that understand that in terms of giving you more perspective on how to heat and how to power your home. Now, you aren't too, if you aren't too, like, I would say, regulated in regard to the actual plumbing, some of you may be thinking about things like composting toilets or, plumbing alternatives. I personally, like, that's kind of one of my, like, passion projects in terms of having to understand that and really design new ways for plumbing to really be dealt with in a way that doesn't require completely abandoning convenience, but also not requiring so much water, because that's something that is something that I feel like we don't really understand the amount of privilege, I suppose, and also, just the idea, I suppose, of when do you think that a government would say, hey, we're going to impose restrictions on water? That's not going to be something that they just say really before they hit the red level. Governments, they want you to essentially just be as comfortable as possible, and having people disconnected, I think, is really a tremendous power of a lot of politicians right now. And having this idea of water in general with the plumbing, I think I've really wrapped my head around, which explains this sidebar, because plumbing is something that you can totally save a lot of water with, right? Especially in a water restrictive area. The idea of plumbing, composting toilets, look into composting systems, look into really how to regulate things. Also, when you're talking about designing, if you know there's going to be a composting toilet in there, you may want to take that extra bit of time to understand how to design that space, right? So normally exhaust fans go in bathrooms, right? So if you have maybe a continuous exhaust fan that is more so, that is more equipped to deal with what's expected from the compost toilet. If, in terms of the venting, the space, right, how the actual odor moves, if, how the odor can possibly not have to leave into the bathroom, but can leave through the vent that's usually comes with composting toilets. And that could, maybe that can be paired with the exhaust system in some way in terms of the actual I guess the power or the electrical powered exhaust system as well. And these ideas, in terms of composting, could also be paired with things like human manure, and and this is assuming that you're living a life that's not gonna fill you up with all types of chemicals. Then you may want to look at, or this may be even more appealing to you. But if you are, if I mean, apparently human manure is, it's not going to be so good if you're living the conventional American life, which is sad in itself. But I think it's something that people really do need to think about and consider as well, especially if they're going to use it in their own gardens. And this is, a lot of this stuff is going to be taking the time to do the research, and you may be able to really understand and really modify your approach based on things like, for instance, does your city require a separate sewer line to go to your tiny home? Are you in terms of your land and your soil situation, if you're working with septic and you have to worry about the extra load on the septic, they're going to essentially have to make it adaptations. But can they? Is that going to restrict you even further in terms of even the space that's available, the available space for your tiny home, for your particular project? These are things that you should know about and understand. And honestly, you could end up just completely deciding to scrap the project, which I think kind of leads me to another thing that I want to put out there is tiny homes may not be we just talked about them, but they may not always be the best fit. We talked about how prefab tiny homes aren't always the best fit for everybody, but also tiny homes in general, right? Can you adapt your individual space to serve your particular needs, right? Uh, that's very much something that you might want to look at. What are the incentives for different co-living arrangements in your particular county? These are things that you want to kind of take a look at and understand, like, oh, okay, well, maybe let's think about, renovating the home, or, to essentially provide, another bedroom or something like that. That may be the best option because you might not be using a particular space. In any case, I think it's I want to wish you good luck, whatever project when ends up taking place. And consultations, if you are thinking about getting a consultation with me, they're going to be $150 per hour and a $300 minimum for any appointment. And if I have to break out my AutoCAD or structural design software to create plans or blueprints, it's like I said, it's going to cost you more, right? And that is and what the perspective that I'm giving you here, I really want to make sure to help you guys understand what to reasonably expect from people outside. I'm totally, in terms of this particular, my offerings for a consultation, I'm willing to work with like architects, engineers, or contractors as well. But I don't want you guys to get a designer and expect them to have the level of insight, right? And even a contractor or even engineer in some cases, they won't have that. They simply won't, because just to give you guys an understanding, like, I worked all across construction, right? And I would say that I'm kind of a special nugget in construction, right? Not trying to. If it helps, that's totally cool if it helps me sell myself. But Also, when it comes down to reaching outside, you guys should also understand that this is, uh, not everybody has that insight, right? I started in contracting, and I went to school for some, for particularly, which is crazy, but I went to school and gained kind of a respect through kind of the biology and stuff like that, and respect for science. So I graduated school, and I got really, I got turned away from kind of or turned off of the whole research world, and I came back to construction, and I got into all of this stuff from the mindset of someone who's really like a science-minded person in general, in terms of like trying to figure out things, and also working through construction in terms of gaining, I would say, more so just on the job experience. And it helped me relay this message in a way that's maybe more plain than a lot of other people on the job sites and out there. That is something that's something that a lot of YouTubers online, they're probably like, just they're not, you don't really appreciate a lot of what you get on YouTube in terms of the amount of translation that has to occur for someone to particularly understand things like construction and then relay that to a YouTube audience. The filter that has to really take place, or that has to really be set to do that, is a very special filter, right? The relaying of that information. So when you like, we don't live in a world filled with uh, creator construction people, right? And that's for a reason, because it does take a lot to explain a lot of this stuff, and that's gonna be something that you don't necessarily get from everybody. And in some cases, like I talked about how I'm, trying to explain like the going into details about the structure and the nuances that could be involved in the structure. You don't want all of that. A lot of times you can just get it straight. You can get it straight served to you by, hey, look, there's a tiny home prefab that we can put on here for X amount of dollars. And that could be something that works out best. Like, all the talking that I'm doing right now, might be completely useless to a contractor who just knows, like, hey, we can get this prefab on the ground in X amount of time. Simple, plain put, and you won't even have to spend a significant amount of time to do it. And so I want you, and that's to really tell you guys to understand this idea of what I'm doing here, the construction aspect of this. I love construction. I have a deep appreciation for the trades and the people, and I don't want to really program you guys to go out and have these high expectations of people, of regular people on the field. I really have honestly, just a passion, too many passion projects, but a passion project in general that I'm working on, that kind of puts me in a position to where, like, maybe this may help me get to the passion project. So I'm in a position to where, one, I want to essentially do well to purvey this message and succeed on YouTube. But also, I want to purvey this message and help construction in general and the quality of construction, in terms of, I want to do this without necessarily being attached to the idea of job security, right? Like, I'm not trying to have a job doing this. I'm not gonna this consultation, if you're looking at this 5 years from now or something like that, it's not it's probably not going to be a thing that I'm doing right now, right? Like, I'm sure you can if you get in touch with me, then I'll be able to, and I'll probably, be willing to help you. But this isn't something that I'm trying to do. This isn't my actual career path. So when normal people have this as their career path and you approach them, have respect for what they do and understand their experience. Not to say that there are not absolute con men out there, right? That can totally be a thing, and you want to look out for that. You want to look out for people that kind of like are just more predatory in nature. But you also want to understand that this idea of the expectations that you could be getting from YouTube, you need to realize that that's not going to apply to everybody. And what you want to do is you want to develop your understanding so you can ask powerful questions, right? Like, okay, cool. If I have a mixed foundation, what's my floor going to look like? What kind of expectations can I really expect if I'm just going to have like hardwood on the first, on this entire floor? Is that going to affect that? And how is that going to affect that? And that question right there, it can turn a designer into, into just a simple machine of efficiency in terms of understanding, like, okay, cool. Well, if you're worried about that, then XYZ. But don't just expect things like that, especially when you're not like paying like top dollar. I think that's a general understanding. Like I can I can particularly I can work on those like just expensive homes or whatever and try to get that out there. Not everybody can do that, right? That's not for everybody. And I am not trying to make my career out of that. I'm not trying to um, really take premium prices. I'm more interested in things like affordable construction. So I am in a niche kind of area to be even able to explain all this stuff and be willing to explain all this stuff to you. And I really hope that kind of sets your expectations out there. And if you're interested in the consultation and it is like not too far from the actual posting of this video, please, by all means, reach out. And I mean that for, of course, homeowners in terms of people who are trying to do it yourself, but contractors as well. They can certainly, like, if they're working with a project and they're trying to learn a lot, I believe that I can be a tremendous source of help in terms of understanding not only that project, but carrying that on with you in terms of the understanding and the knowledge to where what I really want to do in all cases is for, if there is somebody that comes back for a consultation, for that person to get, for the consultations to become more and more effective, and they become more and more effective in general, so where they're not coming back to, basically for, as repeat customers with the repeat consultation. Contractors, engineers as well, architects, please, get if you found value in this video, please like it. By all means, please subscribe, but also like, comment if you want to hear anything else in the, about really what kind of expansions do you guys really want me to make on different topics, right? Structural, of course, I'm always willing to do that, but also things like electrical and sewer. I love, learning more about this stuff and would happily learn with you guys. And also, if you're like, if you're some kind of like, I, I'm, I am firmly like, maybe if I am overconfident in my idea of construction, please by all means let me know. If you can give me more insight in terms of electrical, sewer, permaculture, in terms of actually like having to experience these things or live these things, and maybe give valuable insight to somebody that may be looking at those things, please post as well. And like I said, in various ways I can kind of help you guys with the consultation. And in any case, you guys are going to have to, like, I'm going to require you guys to at least think about what you're getting out of this consultation if we do that. But uh, if I think I yeah, that's we're gonna wrap up there. And like I said, please like, comment, subscribe, and I hope to see you soon.